story about your surgery.
Yes. So I had my surgery in Florida and in June, and like people think Florida's vacation land, but in the summertime it gets really hot, like 100 degrees, full on humidity. Absolutely, you can't even inhabit. You know, people flee Florida in the summer. they vacation there in the winter, and then the people flee in the summer. And I was staying in a condo that was an hour away from the surgery center. And so 4 days after my surgery, I had to go get my bandages off. And so my friend drove me, I had a friend in Florida, thankfully, who drove me around. And so we drove to the surgery center to get my bandages off. And it was just so hot. And by the time we got to the surgery center, I nearly had heat stroke. I was in these hot bandages. She didn't have air conditioned, air conditioning. We were just rolling around in her hoopty. And I almost felt delirious. And so while at the center, I drank just copious amounts of water. And my bladder is the size of a kidney bean. And so on the way back, we had to stop and pee, and there was nothing in sight. Because between the surgery center and the condo, there's just this huge stretch of swamp. So she just pulled over on the side of the road. I'm from the Midwest. I don't know anything about Florida or its wildlife or, whatever. And I'm about to pee my pants. And so I jump out of the car and I squat on the ground. And before I even begin to pee, I feel like there's a million needles like stabbing into my ass. And I jump up and I look down, and I had squatted right into a red ant hill, or a red ant colony. There was like 10 hills. There's so many. And so there was red ants, and they were crawling over my ass, and they're on my legs, and they're crawling into my genitals, and they're biting the fuck out of me. And I just had surgery. And so I didn't have a full range of motion, and so I could get him off in the front, but I couldn't reach in the back and get him off. And so my friend had to get out of the car, and a great friend, by the way, and she had to pick the ants out of my genitals. And it was a suck fest. And so, my ass hurt on the way back, and what I didn't know about red ant bites is not only do they raise up like mosquito bites, but they form pustules like, really bad nodular acne. So my ass looked like the face of like a 14-year-old boy.
Wow, that's quite a friend that's willing to do that. It reminds you of the old snake bit story, where somebody's snake bit and they got to suck the poison out, and that's a famous story that Red Fox tells, that he runs to the doctor and the doctor says, "You've got to cut a little slit and suck the poison out." And he goes back to his friend who's laying there and had been bit in the cock, and he's like, "What'd the doctor say?" And Red Fox says, "You're going to die." Well, fortunately, your friend didn't take that attitude.
Yeah, I'll never forget it. It was straight out of like a slapstick comedy, that's for sure.
Sharing that with us. The next question I have for you is, how would you define your sexual orientation?
My sexual orientation has gone through radical changes as I've gotten older. At first, I identified as straight because that's kind of like the inherited sexual orientation that everyone gets when they're born in America. Like, oh, you're automatically straight. And then as I got older and I realized that I wanted to feel more masculine, I started to identify as a gay woman. But then realized that didn't feel correct because I also liked sleeping with cisgendered men, and then later on discovered I liked sleeping, having sexual intercourse with trans bodies. And so now I identify as queer, and I'm just kind of a fast and loose, like, I'm an equal opportunity sexer. I just like to have sex, and I'm really sexual, and I'm sex positive. And me being sex positive comes from, growing up in a society where sex is repressed, and me really wanting to push back on that, and taking ownership of my sexuality has been a really liberating experience, and it's almost like an internal revolution.
Yeah, I'm probably wading into some weeds that I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to ask you a question that a lot of people discuss and talk about, and that is the effects of tea on your sex drive. Mm-hmm. Would you say that you've had a noticeable difference since, how long have you been on tea?
I've been on testosterone for 9.5 months.
Okay, and so would you say that you've noticed a noticeable difference in your sex drive since you began?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I used to, before I was on T, I would, maybe need to get off, like maybe like once a day, once every other day, and now it's like 3 times a day, and I've become more like sexually indiscriminate. To be honest, I've started taking more risks, which, I'm not necessarily proud of. And also, before I started T, it was like, cool, I like having sex and it's something that I want to do. But now, like when I get the urge, it's like I need to resolve that urge before I do anything else. And so it's become quite interesting, and at times it's actually kind of annoying because I want to be doing something else. Like I'll lay down in my bed to read, and then I'll get the urge to get off, and I can't concentrate on anything else, and at times it's time consuming, but also really fun.
What message would you like to give to other trans men thinking about transitioning, if you have a message? Maybe perhaps you don't.
I guess if I were going to give a message to other people that were thinking about transitioning, first of all, it's difficult for me to give a message simply because everyone's experience is very individualized and I don't know the context in which they're operating. However, if I were to give a message, I would perhaps say that this transition is about you. It's about you, and it's about the way that you feel about yourself and the way that you feel about the space in which you occupy in the world. And it's about no one else. And I really had to come to know that, and at times I still have to come to know it.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. We'll move on to adult content videos, or what some people like to call porn. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious as to start with, what made you decide to get into adult content videos?
Yeah, first of all, it looks glamorous, to be honest, and I like having sex, and I'm like sex obsessed. I use obsessed, hyperbolically, and I also I want to be objectified because it makes me feel hot, and it's probably like a thing within myself where, if I want to be really honest, and this is no one else's experience, this is my experience, but I want to be considered hot, and I want people to watch me and get off on it because I find it validating.
If I can share an honest moment you and I discussed earlier, when you were presenting as female and going through that period in your 20s, one of the things you told me, and it's obvious from your look, that you're very, very attractive. And you talked about that in terms of some societal gains, or some advantages that you had and that you were concerned about giving up. I'd kind of like to share that with our audience.
Yes. I think a lot about social stratification, and I think a lot about privilege in society. And women have privilege attached to them, or they gain privilege based on their aesthetic, because their aesthetic is how they're valued in a male-dominated society. And I was very aware of that. And when I was presenting as female, I had a really unique aesthetic, and people would sometimes stop me in public and they would say, "You look very beautiful," and I was considered very attractive. And I got a lot of validation from the outside society when I was following those gender norms and presenting as female, and people found me very attractive, and it allowed me to gain access. And when I was trying to make the decision of whether or not to transition, that was something that played into my decision. I thought, do I want to give up this privilege? Do I want to give up having this aesthetic that people find pleasing, and take a gamble, understanding that I may not look that attractive, or I may look awkward, or I may not pass that well? And I ultimately came to the decision that I needed to try, because if I were on my deathbed and I had never tried to transition, I would probably really regret it.
Okay, so we're switching back into porn here, and I'm kind of interested in switching back between some serious and not so serious issues. But so, do you watch porn?
All the time. All the time. So much porn.
Yeah. So what are your favorite porn scenes? I know that word you don't like, favorite, but if just some porn scenes that stick out in your mind is these are really hot and I can really get off to these.
Oh man, I really love gangbang scenes. I love those really hard angles where you're watching penetration. I like cocks in porn. I just like cocks in my porn. I think they're great, and I like cocks and ejaculation, and oral. God, Yeah, I don't know. I think it like I don't know how to describe my favorite porn scenes, but I like it when it's really graphic. You know, when there's like boobs and cocks and holes and they're flying everywhere, and I'm like, yes.
So, what is your biggest fantasy that you have yet to live out sexually?
So, I find intellectuals really sexy. There's something about an intellectual person that turns me on, and I have a lot of instructors in college who I really respect, and they're amazing facilitators, and they're very smart, and they have a lot to offer me, and usually I always want to have sex with them. And so my greatest fantasy is that they'll call me, you know, one of them will call me, they're usually male, college professors will call me to his office, and we'll have to discuss something, and then, you know, all of a sudden they'll be like insinuating it's sex, and I'll pick up on the insinuation, and it will just kind of unroll from there. So yeah, having sex with my professors, I think, is my big sex fantasy.
What's the wildest thing you've ever done sexually?
I had an orgy when I was 17 at my work. I worked at this bed and breakfast in Madison. It was themed after Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And it's no longer, so I feel like pretty comfortable. But anyways, the rooms were really luxurious, like $400 a night, just beautiful. There's, you know, private libraries in the rooms, and I worked there for a year when I was 17 and 18, and one night I rented a room. For some reason I was like having a night out, and I got it for really cheap because I worked there. And my friends and I went to a club my older brother was working at, so we got in, and we picked up some guys, and we brought them back, and we just got really crazy, and we were just like fucking against the walls and knocking pictures down, and it was just really wild.
Sounds really hot. How about non-sexually? What would you say is one of the most exciting things you've done in your life non-sexually?
Exciting. I can think of like dangerous things, but I don't know if I can think of anything like wholesomely exciting.
Are you into kink?
No, actually. I hate to disappoint everyone, but I'm actually quite vanilla.
Are you in a relationship?
No, so I rarely get into partnerships. I like to have many lovers. So I would say that I have like a lover who I see a lot, but I'm not in a like monogamous relationship.
So when you look at the idea of a relationship as non-monogamous, what type of people would you be interested in?
I love people that don't get jealous, who have their own lives, who give me a lot of space, who are intellectually stimulating. I'm really attracted to writers, artists, musicians. I like people who are socially awkward, who like don't follow social norms, or like who don't understand them. I just really appreciate not having to go through like all of that like obligatory like courtesy, you know, with a person. And someone who's like really sexually open, who I feel totally accepted by.
So one last question. There aren't many FTM or trans male porn stars, but there are a few. Which one would you say is the one you most admire and most like to become like if you were to go on in this industry?
So there's many that I admire, and I, you know, maybe admire them for the way that they perform, or I admire them for their aesthetic, or I just think that they're sexy. But I actually really appreciate Buck Angel simply because he's a pioneer, and I feel like he opened the door for a lot of youngsters, a lot of trans guy, you know, youngsters to get into porn. And so you always have to appreciate and admire a trailblazer. So.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.